Hello, Professor Miller here. Today we're going to be discussing the Gilded Age. This is chapter 18 out of your textbook. Now, there was no hard and fast rule on when the Gilded Age actually started, when it actually ended. The course begins in 1877. However, many scholars believe that the Gilded Age began immediately following the Civil War. I'm of the frame of mind that it began towards the end of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So let's begin with the Gilded Age. By the end of reading chapter 18, after watching this presentation and after reading and watching the supplemental videos and articles that are associated with the lesson this week, you should be able to answer these questions. How did the railroads stimulate big business? Why did social Darwinism, a theory on the treatment of people, appeal to wealthy Americans? What factors influenced political life in the late 19th century? What issues shaped politics? What economic conditions were in play? And how did big business come to dominate the Gilded Age? To understand the Gilded Age, one has to first try to understand the economy. So after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the economy began in full swing and recovery, right? We were rebuilding the South, we were expanding westward. To do that takes a mighty economy. To do that, you have to have a strong industry. And here we have three major players through the Gilded Age. You have, with the railroad industry and steel industry, you have Andrew Carnegie, you have John D. Rockefeller for oil, and then you have J.P. Morgan, right, America's first major banker. Then you have Henry George, who is the counter, he's the yin to their yang, countering their ideals. We're going to cover all of these folks. Now, while Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Vanderbilt are some of the biggest names of the Gilded Age, some of the most wealthy Americans in history, right? The average worker made less than $380 a year. Put that in contrast to the wealthy elite of the time period, who were multimillionaires beyond belief. Also, during this time period between 1870 and 1880, the U.S. population grew by some 26%. Much of that is due to immigration, folks coming from other countries. We're going to talk a lot more about immigration in the next chapter. Again, to help understand the economy, we have to understand how money has changed and grown. So this data is accurate as of 2017. If you had a dollar in 1877, that same dollar would be worth more than $2,500 today. So as we discuss how much money people made in that time period versus how much money they make in this time period, right, as we adjust those dollars, this is something to keep in mind as we move forward. The next few slides here are all geared towards showing you the stark differences between the haves and the have-nots. So again, if the average person made less than $380 a year, here you have Vanderbilt, right, who ended up building the Biltmore Mansion in North Carolina in 1873. He was still a young man at that time. He amassed more than $100 million in that era's money by building a rail fortune. Andrew Carnegie, when he sold his company, right, in 1901, he was worth a combined dollar amount of more than $400 million. Stark realities between the workers and those in the 1% at the top. I found this information interesting as it transfers money from 1890 into today's dollar amounts. So if the average family earned $380 a year, that means it's about $12,000 in today's currency, where Rockefeller would be worth about $400 billion, Carnegie $370 billion, Vanderbilt $200 billion. Now, when we compare that to the billionaires of our era in today's money, Jeff Bezos is currently worth about $125 billion, where the average salary of an Amazon employee, now this is across all of Amazon, right? Um, they make an average between $29,000 and $40,000 a year, and Bill Gates barely makes the list here with a paltry $96 billion. The reason why this is highlighted is to show you the contrasts between what folks made then to what they would be making now, and to show you the split differences between while many things have changed, many things have not changed. Now, to understand the economy, we have to understand the size and scope of business. So before the Civil War, the largest employer in the United States had about 800 employees. And just a few years later, in the 1870s, right, Pennsylvania Railroad had somewhere around 55,000 employees. You can see the rapid growth and expansion, right? They made about $400 million, and they were the largest private company in the world at that time. Big business expanded greatly after the war. Part of that expansion was largely due to Andrew Carnegie. He arrived in the United States as a penniless Scot. They say he arrived with less than $2.50 in his pocket. He worked his way up through the ranks during the Civil War as a telegraph operator. He also coordinated installing coordinated installing telegraph wires. He was in the right place at the right time. During the war, he met the right people. He networked. He ended up working for a company that produced sleeper cars, and this was a fad during that time period. They were luxury items, and it caught on in a big way. And he basically took the money he made from his networking and being those connections, right? He ended up building the largest and most modern steel factory in the United States. He also adopted a philosophy called social Darwinism. We're going to cover social Darwinism quite a bit later, but essentially what social Darwinism is it's the social aspect, taking Darwin's theory of evolution, survival of the fittest, and applying it to social behaviors of humans. That means Carnegie believed that if you were a fit individual, you would rise to the top. If you were unfit, you were not worthy of survival. Now, Carnegie ended up changing his tune later in life, and when he sold his business for $400 million, right, he gave $300 million away to charity, and he established libraries, charitable organizations around the country. You might be familiar with things like Rockefeller Center in New York, Carnegie Hall in New York. All of those, the Carnegie Foundation, right, are all attributed to Andrew Carnegie in his works later in life. Next, we're moving on to John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was an oil capitalist. But before that, he came from a middle-class working family, and essentially he paid his way out of serving in the Civil War. He did serve in a different capacity, though, rather than a soldier. He ended up being a contractor selling supplies to the military. He became a visionary to understand how oil would be used and how oil could be changed during the Industrial Revolution to modernize things, to be used in all forms of equipment and motor vehicles and those types of things as motor vehicles came on. So he was at the right time and at the right place. He was also considered a shrewd negotiator. He would not take no for an answer. And there's things that he did after negotiations failed later in life during his time at Standard Oil, where he did some very shady things. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the muckrakers of the 1920s. So he used the profits from what he did during the Civil War to buy oil contracts. He traveled around the country, speculated where there might be oil, and bought contracts, and ended up creating this company called Standard Oil. Now, Standard Oil became a monopoly, or what we're going to call during this time period a trust. And when he sold his business, he employed about 100,000 people around the world. And they ended up breaking up, the government ended up breaking up his company, into about 10 or 15 of the companies we know today that distribute oil and gasoline around the United States. So at the beginning of the lecture, I'd mentioned J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan does not appear in this slide deck. However, there is an excellent video that's posted in the classroom, and I strongly encourage you to watch it. Now, We have these robber barons of the era who were incredibly wealthy. Then we have this man, Henry George, who created a philosophy called Georgism. He was born into extreme poverty in Pennsylvania. He traveled west to seek his fortune, like many others during this time period. When he got there, him and his family nearly starved to death. He became so frustrated with having such low pay and such high rent that he ended up writing this book, Progress and Poverty. He called for a single taxpayer system where all of the taxes would come from anything that was created from the land and everyone would be taxed equally. He railed against poverty in the trusts. He wanted to do away with these mega corporations and he wanted safe working environments for working adults, or for working individuals, excuse me, not just adults. He organized a march on Washington that didn't end up being successful. He ended up running for mayor of New York City against Teddy Roosevelt. And while his campaign was not as successful as he would have liked, it ended up garnering much support and helped influence many other changes down the road. And Henry George is an incredibly important figure countering the argument of greed and unbridled capitalism throughout the era. So that brings us to the conclusion of this section on the introduction to the Gilded Age. We discussed in this session, the robber barons of the age. We discussed the economy, and we discussed Henry George. Again, there's some really good videos in the classroom. I strongly encourage you to watch them, read the articles, and read chapter 18 that's associated with this chapter. I hope you're having a great week. Take care.